So there's been a couple of news stories like this one where it says ER nurse tests positive for COVID-19 days after first dose of vaccine. Reminder that protection is not instant. So if you look at this, they say that on December 18th, an ER nurse got the Pfizer vaccine, and then 6 days later, on Christmas Eve, after working a shift, he became sick. Okay, so he got the vaccine. 6 days later, he got sick. So that makes some people think, well, obviously this vaccine doesn't work, or it doesn't work very well, and it's clearly not 95% effective like they are saying in the news. So I think, and then they talk to this infectious disease expert, and he says something like the first dose gives you somewhere around 50%, and you need that second dose to get up to 95%. So that is not a great understanding of how it works either. So the reason that it's not instant protection, when you get the vaccine, you're not instantly protected from getting getting COVID. And there's a second part of it. There is an incubation period for COVID, and even if it was an instantaneous protection, if you were exposed a day before you got the vaccine, then you would have a little incubation period and you could get symptoms after you got the vaccine. But there's two parts. There's an incubation period, and protection from a vaccine is not instantaneous. That's because your immune system has two parts. There's an innate component, which is macrophages, neutrophils, NK cells, and that works instantly. And then there's an adaptive component, which basically has to make T cell responses and antibody responses so there's a T cell receptor, and then antibodies are specific for the pathogen made by B cells, and that takes about 4 to 7 days for it to kick in. So after you get the vaccine, your adaptive immune system gets a good look at it, processes it, and in about 4 to 7 days, it starts making antibodies and T cell receptors that respond to that thing. And so after about 4 to 7 days, if you're exposed to the virus, then it would theoretically protect you. And then we know that the incubation period of COVID is about an average of 5 days. So if you got antibodies at 7 days and then you were exposed at 7 days, and it went 5 days after that, that would be about 12 days. So you could still theoretically get, if you had like 6 days and you didn't have quite full protection and you got exposed to the virus, at day 11 you could still get symptoms. But from like day 7 on, you would be protected. But the symptoms would not show up until like day 12 or day 13, if that makes sense. Um, so here's how you get at the 95% effective rate. This is how you get at the 95% effective rate that's being quoted in the news. So this is the emergency use authorization fact sheet from Pfizer, and I'll link this document below. And so if you go to page 23 of the document, they talk about their primary endpoint analysis. And what they say is they looked at all the instances of symptomatic COVID-19 starting from 7 days after dose 2. Okay, so they find all the people that get symptomatic COVID 7 days after dose 2. And so in the people who got the vaccine, they had 8 cases. In the people who got the placebo, they had 162 cases. So the way they come to this 95% vaccine effectiveness rate is they assume that if you didn't get the vaccine, you would have 162. So they had about 18,000 in this group and about 18,000 in this group. And then out of this 18,000, 162 of them got COVID, symptomatic COVID. And so you would expect, if the vaccine doesn't do anything, you would expect to see 162 here. But instead, you saw 8. So what they're saying is instead of getting 162, you had 8, so you protected 154 people. There's 154 people in this group that would have gotten it if they didn't have protection. And so you protected 154, you divide that by 162, and that's how you get the 95% protection. So you're saying you've protected 154 people, which is 95% of the people that would have gotten it. And then if you go down further here, this is where people get that erroneous 50% after the first dose. This is a graph showing the instances of COVID in their two cohorts. So the red is their placebo group, and the blue is their vaccine group. And day 0 is the day that they got the first dose of vaccine. Day 7 is the day they got the second dose of vaccine. And then any cases after day 35 is what they're counting. So along this line, there were 162 cases after day 35, and in this group there were 8 cases after day 35. So look at what happens. Actually, you see that the number of COVID cases after the first dose are exactly the same between the two groups. So at day 1, day 2, day 3, your people are still getting symptomatic COVID, and then around day 11, the curves diverge. You see, so this is day 14. So around day 11, the curves diverge. So in their test cohort, after the vaccine, up until day 11, you got exactly the same number of cases. That's because probably the adaptive immunity system did not have full function until about day 4, 5, 6, or 7. And then if you got exposed here and it wasn't fully working, you had this incubation period and you still had symptoms here. But if you got exposed here at like day 8, then you were protected. Like you didn't show up with the cases. So basically, this doesn't mean that you're protected at day 11. This means you were protected probably whatever the incubation period of the disease is, which is like 5 days. So you're probably protected around day 7. So if you're exposed around day 7 after your vaccine, you're probably protected. But if you were exposed at like day 2, 3, 4, 5, you probably weren't protected at the time. The innate immune system had not kicked in. But the symptoms from the time that you were exposed, if you were exposed here, your symptoms didn't show up until here. Okay, so the way they're getting this 50% is they're saying, oh, we take all the people that got COVID in this line and compare it to this line before day 28, it's about 50%. But see, you can't count this. This is the part where the innate immunity hasn't kicked in yet. And what's interesting is after day 11, the curve, the slope flattens, and the slope does not change after the second dose. So this slope is pretty flat and it remains flat. So if you would expect, if you got like 50% protection after the first dose, you would see this graph like this. Okay, it would be like it'd be better than this, not as good as this. It'd be going like this, and then after the second dose, then it would flatten out, and the curve would shift again. So, I mean, if you just calculate by raw numbers, yeah, it's about 50%. But if you look at the slope is about the same. So that's why you can still get COVID after the first vaccine dose, and it doesn't mean the vaccine's not working. And also, this whole 50% doesn't mean that the first dose gives you 50% protection and the second dose gives you 95% protection. It looks like you get almost a full 95% protection with the first dose. The second booster dose is just more likely to help the length of immunity protection, to give you a booster to strengthen the memory effect of the memory B cells and the T cells. So I hope that clears it up. So that's why that's how we arrive at the 95% effectiveness rate from this pretty large and well-done study of about 40,000 people, and that's where people are getting the 50% effectiveness rate after the first dose. But that's kind of probably a misinterpretation of the data, and that lag in the time it takes for adaptive immunity to kick in, and also the incubation period of the virus, is what what makes it so that it's possible for you to get COVID up to like about 2 weeks after um, the first vaccine dose. But your protection probably starts at about 1 week. All right, so if you have any questions or comments, comment below, and I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thanks for watching.